Hello everyone, my name is Vania. I'm a master's student in history at Ca' Foscari University of Venice, where I'm currently working on adultery in Merovingian law courts. Before starting off, let me say thank you to the whole committee who made this event possible and gave me the opportunity to present my work here. I hope that this 20 minutes or so presentation can at least be a stimulating distraction from the difficult situation that we're currently living in. As you can see from the slide, today I'm concentrating on a very specific topic: bodies, the gendering, and how the spectacle of gendering bodies was exploited in the legal culture of 6th century France, where female legal agency was completely denied, and the only agency a woman could expect was her role as wife and childbearer. In particular, I will weave my argument about a very specific gendered crime, adultery. Now, I chose this crime not out of pure volition, but rather due to the stark differences in proceedings for men and women related to this crime, showing how the female body was much more objectified and used as a scapegoat for the crime and sin of adultery compared to men's. But let's start from this. So this presentation should interject three main topics. In the first part, I hope to show how female gender norms were strictly rooted in one's own visual display of the body. There is a whole bunch of literature on this topic, which focuses mostly on the material culture and which you can easily find in the brief bibliography I have provided in the handout to this presentation. Second, I want to demonstrate that this visual aspect of the gendered body was reflected in the way crimes were defined and punished by law courts. That is to say, despite the fact that in theory both men and women were liable to be accused of adultery as criminals and sinners, there were different ways in which such crime was punished if you were a man or a woman. If you were a woman, the punishment was more likely to involve your body than if you were a man, which means that physical punishment was preferred. Finally, in the last part of my presentation, I hope to deal briefly with resistance to these strict gender and sexual norms. I will provide a single example of rebelling to this system due to the limited time. I must admit that at first I had identified this passage as an example of typically female resistance to the whole system imposed by men on women. But I realized that this passage is quite controversial, and its analysis will probably end up in an open question for you and everyone to answer, really. But let's start with the sources, specifically material culture and law courts. So archaeology is not really my cup of tea, but I think it's worth going on it because it's the most revealing piece of evidence we probably have to answer the question of what made a woman in society's eyes. In other words, how was female gender framed physically? Perhaps unsurprisingly, the ideal of female gender revolved around marriage and fertility, which means that a woman's purpose, or rather, a woman's value, stood in her fulfillment of marriage and child-rearing, but only at a certain stage of their life. Femininity was expressed differently based on the age of the deceased in grave goods. For example, to put it in general terms, the femininity of female children was not fully developed until a certain age. So, for example, small female children tended to be buried with fewer, more gender-neutral goods. But adult women's graves, those who had passed puberty, do show highly female artifacts, which highlight highly symbolic parts, which were supposedly the focuses of the visual display of female gender in the body: the head, the hair, the wrists, and the breasts. And you can see on this slide the outcome of Professor Halsall's studies on cemeteries of eastern France. Brooches, headpins, bracelets, and necklaces were truly at the core of a woman's portrayal in death. Now, this is not only testified in grave goods. If you look at the Salic Law, you can definitely argue that a woman's worth was based on her capability of fulfilling her role as mother to her children. In Title 24, which deals with murders of women and children, it is very clear that the value of a woman triples if she literally has started to have children. Widows or unmarried women who don't have this benefit are worth only 200 solidi, compared to the 600 solidi of a fertile woman. More than this, it is clear that offences against one of those highly symbolic body parts we were mentioning earlier, the hair, and so on, are those who require the highest compensations by the offenders. Clearly, there is a female gender paradigm going on here, even from the visual aspect. Now, before moving on to adultery, let's briefly summarize this. Femininity in the Merovingian world is framed by ages and life stages. For the value of a woman, even in monetary terms, varies according to how close or involved she is in a marital union, and whether she has already started to have children or not. This is shown in the law courts, where physical offences are punished quite seriously, especially if they are carried out against certain parts of the female body, the hair, the arms, the breast, etc. And now you might ask why such high value for women? Possibly because they were more vulnerable, according to some historians, possibly because there was literal shortage of women at the time, according to other studies, or maybe because they were powerful tools for alliances, according to Lévi-Strauss' argument. What's really at stake here is the visual representation of femininity. Now, let's turn to the second issue of this presentation, adultery. A little disclaimer before I move on to the analysis itself. The Salic Law was emanated at the beginning of the 6th century, but was put under constant revision several times during the following centuries, until more or less the 9th century, so the end of the Carolingian time. What I am analyzing now is only the evidence from the Merovingian times. I left out all the titles that were added in the Carolingian times. So now we're ready to go. First, you can see in the code that the formulation of adultery is in terms of male culpability when it comes to adultery. That is, titles 13 and 15 deal with men who have committed adultery with someone else's wife, fiancée, or daughter, but do not deal with women committing adultery. Of course, it is not surprising that the closer a woman victim of adultery is to marriage, or the more involved she is in one, the more serious the offence. That is to say, that if I, a Frankish freeman, commit adultery with a non-married girl, I am liable to pay less in compensation to the injured party, that is, her father, than if I had committed it with a married woman. All in all, the sums, as we will see in a minute, are pretty high in general for compensations. Other barbarian law courts, the Salic Law offers compensation sums which are unbelievably high. This is because, in most cases, the system encouraged negotiation between parties and the activation of so-called solidarity networks. In other words, it is unlikely that someone will be able to pay something like 200 solidi in compensation for an act of adultery. Rather, it seems more likely that this system was based on the exchange of favors, credit, and negotiation to excuse someone of a sexual crime with a much lower sum. And of course, by that excused someone, I mean a man. Because, as we will see in a minute, women did not really have monetary power, and it is likely that they did not have even negotiation power, but were forced to rely on their male relatives to get out of a charge of adultery crime. Finally, I want to point out that so far I have been speaking about adultery, but in reality it is not clear where to draw the line between adultery itself and rape, for example. Rape, indeed, is defined in terms of forced, violent adultery, which is quite peculiar. This, of course, also brings up questions about the consent of these actions. But that's another question. I cannot answer these, unfortunately, in this brief presentation. In this slide, I have tried to summarize the content of the Salic Law on the penalty for the crime of adultery. You can notice a few things. First, women seem not to have been held liable for any punishment whatsoever, and thus, by the same token, no one could hypothesize easily that they were not held responsible for adultery at all as a crime, even though they might have been, for adultery as a sin, of course. Second, you notice how widows, who in theory were those women who not only had naturally ended their marital relationship with the husband because of their death, but also who had stopped having children, were not even entered in the code as possible culprits or victims of the crime of adultery. So, does this mean that women were held innocent or were considered impossible of criminal agency when it came down to adultery? Absolutely not. The fact that the Salic Law offers no punishment for women simply means that A, this was negotiated by men, and B, we have to look elsewhere than the law code itself to find the customs for female punishment. Indeed, the whole deal of procedures for dealing with women and the crime of adultery was based on customary justice and men's decision. Let's have a look at the case in which adultery had yet to be attested. In particular, there is consistent evidence that ordeal by water was a peculiarly female judicial procedure in case of adultery, meaning that mostly women accused of adultery were subject to this test in order to establish whether they were actually guilty of the crime or not. Why so? So this has been a relevant topic also in the Icelandic context, and the answer by Ian Miller is that adultery put into question the legitimacy of any offspring that might have resulted from the adulterous union. Whose father were the children of that woman if she had lied with someone else other than her husband? How to test this? No other feasible way than a good old ordeal, which put under the spotlight the woman's sinful and polluted body and visually demonstrated her innocence or guilt. You can see in the excerpt of the passage above that ordeal by water was a proper spectacle. Briefly summarizing it, a woman is accused of adultery by her husband, but the judge is not able to prove her innocent, so she is condemned to be submerged in the river Saône. But she does not die, because God grants her salvation, and this act is assumed to be the proof of her innocence by everyone. The matter is not inquired further. What this passage shows quite clearly is not only that Frankish justice was deeply Christian, but also that adultery was processed because of the social and moral pressure put onto the husband by testing the woman's body. It was a matter of a man's honor to have a faithful wife. This given, other passages in the works of Gregory of Tours also prove that women were punished with death, according to custom, a late Roman custom actually. This pertained both to married women caught red-handed in an adulterous act and non-married women found in an illicit sexual relationship with someone else who, in more than one case, I must admit, is a clergyman. But this last aspect probably pertains more to the author's own bias against the corrupted sexuality of his fellow priests and bishops, rather than an actual statistic. So I have reported here two different passages in the histories of Gregory of Tours which show that women were quite likely to be punished with death by their own husband or male relative. This was quite a convenient way, in monetary terms, to deal with the problem, because it allowed them to completely erase the adultery issue within the family without giving out a single penny. You also notice that in both cases, fire is used to cleanse, in a way, the very body of the woman when she is condemned to death. I believe that there is definitely some sort of leitmotif going on here. So let's summarize this. Adultery was a very serious crime, and although both men and women were held liable for it, it was women who suffered the most spectacular and cruel punishments, which were decided by male negotiation and imposed on female bodies as a way of erasing the pollution. In a way, we could say that women had no legal agency in the Merovingian justice, at least in the matter of adultery. They were simply tests for a male relative's honor and a possible danger to orthodox kinship links, as well as carriers of unforgiving sin. The only way out for a woman, according to her relatives, was death. This was performed more spectacularly when possible, so that this procedure acquired a clear recognition from the whole society. Let's finally turn to our last topic for this presentation. At this point, we can conclude that although we now are well aware that one's own gender does not define one's own sexuality, that is, if I declare myself a lesbian, it does not mean that I am more manly than womanly. In the Merovingian time, if you were a woman, you had to fulfill the ideal of a heterosexual wife. The crime of adultery, then, put into question your own gender expectations, and its punishment might be considered a way to norm transgression. But are there any instances of open defiance of such judicial system? The passage that you see here is taken from the histories of Gregory of Tours, and I first selected it because I thought that it could be a good example of defiance of a woman towards male justice. But now I think that I was wrong, and let me tell you why. The story goes like this. A woman is accused of adultery by her husband's family, but her own father believes that she is completely innocent. The two parties involved get into what we might call, actually, a family feud after a failure at finding compromise on this issue. So basically, the husband's family does not believe the woman's father, even after he performed an oath-taking ritual on the tomb of Saint Denis. In the end, when the matter of the judgment has been given into the hands of a bishop to solve both the feud and adultery crime, none of the men's parties are actually found guilty of any violent act, despite the fact that they have been killing each other on sacred soil of a church and probably also defied the procedures for oath-taking. At the end, the woman is called for a trial by a judge or maybe the bishop himself, we don't know. But the woman will never be tried, because she dies by committing suicide with a rope around her neck. Now, I first thought This could be a good instance of female agency. The woman, after all the violence that had happened because she was presumed to be guilty of adultery, decides to take charge of her fate instead of waiting for others, that is, the man, imposing it on her. She would rather die, in other words, by her own hands, rather than her husband's or her relatives. But I think I was fooled, because instead of being a heroine, the woman ends up replicating the violent language of the very justice system which put her behaviour on the spot. This is an idea that you find, for example, in Judith Butler's analysis of Antigone's fate. Antigone might be a heroine to us, but she is condemned by death by her own adherence to conventional kinship norms. That is, she is aware that she is the offspring of an incestuous union, and knows that there is no way out of her insistence on burying her brother Polynices, despite the laws of the city prohibiting it. She is incestuously, illicitly in love with her dead brother. Creon might condemn her to death, and she might appear to defy him, refusing tacitly to respond to the charges against her. But this is because she knows that refuting him or not refuting him will have the same outcome, death. And death is what the patriarchy had wanted for her. She even seems to embody death itself in the painting that I have put up on this slide. But, to conclude, this is only my opinion. What is wonderful about the story of Antigone and the woman who committed suicide is that agency is indeed there. Whether you consider it female or not, and most of all, whether you consider this gender qualification important or not, is still up for us to decide. On this note, I want to deeply thank you all for the attention and remind you that for any question, criticism, or whatever, I am here to answer it to the best of my knowledge, if I can, of course. And you can see that I have put up an email address for you to look and write me to if you want to. Thank you again.